We all know how dreadful of a disease cancer is, and many of us are familiar with the suffering it can inflict by witnessing a loved one's or our own personal experiences. What's even more concerning is that as life expectancy increases and the global population ages, cancer incidence rates are expected to increase as a result, as well as other age-correlated diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. For these reasons, studying cancer and researching methods for treatment and diagnostics has never been more important than right now. The good news is that researchers have never understood cancer better than right now, including what enables cancer to take over our bodies and cause so much damage. Today, we will be covering one of cancer's main tactics of survival, the Warburg Effect, to hopefully build a better understanding of what cancer really is and get an idea of what methods researchers are looking into to develop new cancer treatment options and diagnostic tools. Now, most of us already associate cancer with tumors, but a tumor is just a collection of rapidly dividing cancer cells. The key point to take away here is that cancer is defined as a cellular process, a cellular disease. This is significant because our bodies are made up of cells. In fact, about 30 trillion cells. That's 1,030,000 times over. Every single one of these cells is in close communication with all its neighboring cells, receiving cues or signals for when to reproduce and divide, or when to play it cool and hunker down. Now, this communication is highly regulated, meaning a cell will only signal to its neighbors to reproduce when absolutely necessary according to our body's needs. This is why after childhood, we don't continue to grow indefinitely larger, because at some point, our cells recognize that growing larger would require more energy than we can obtain and process, and that would be inefficient. So the cells say, hey, we're good, let's chill and take a break. However, cancer cells do not play by the rules when it comes to this cellular communication. In his review, How Cancer Arises, cancer biologist Dr. Robert Weinberg puts it rather sinisterly. Cancer cells become deaf to the usual controls on proliferation and follow their own internal agenda for reproduction, meaning that cancer cells no longer communicate with their neighboring healthy cells about when to grow and divide, instead choosing to replicate whenever they feel like it, and the most destructive cancer cells choose to replicate very frequently. Think of it like when teenagers stop listening to their parents and decide they're grown enough to go out whenever they like, except very expensive to care for and potentially deadly. Well, I guess exactly like teenagers then. You may ask, now hold on a second, if cancer cells have chosen to grow and divide so frequently, wouldn't they require much more energy to maintain this rapid growth and division, like previously mentioned? To which I would answer, yes, you're absolutely correct. Kind of. With biochemistry research done in the last 10 to 15 years or so, we have learned that cancer cells can rewire their metabolism to satisfy the increased demands of rapid proliferation. Now, interestingly, for rapidly dividing cancer cells, energy is not the limiting resource. Rather, the limiting resource is biological building blocks, such as proteins, cell membranes, nuclei, and everything else it takes to build a cell. Oh, and by the way, metabolism refers to any chemical process inside an organism which helps to maintain life. This includes taking in food and converting it into energy and building blocks. So, next time you're worried about your low metabolism and you're contemplating whether to eat ice cream or not, just ask yourself, is this helping me maintain life? Now, this idea of cancer cells rewiring their metabolism isn't new. In fact, it was first probed in the 1920s by a great German biochemist named Otto Warburg, who made the clever observation that cancer cells eat up much more sugar than healthy cells do. Using this knowledge, biochemists began performing experiments asking whether this was the only metabolic change associated with cancer. Then later, in the 1950s, Warburg further proposed that broken mitochondria, that's right, powerhouses of our cell, are to blame for the increased sugar uptake observed in cancer cells. And he insisted that this event was the primary cause of cancer. Now, he wasn't bang on with this idea in particular, but he was correct in suspecting something rather cheeky was happening in those mitochondria. 70 years later, today we now have a pretty good but not perfect understanding of all the changes that occur with a cancer cell's metabolism. We now call this metabolic shift the Warburg Effect and recognize it as the hallmark of cancer. Nearly every type of cancer cell exhibits this behavior. Now, we're going to dive into a cancer cell and look at what crafty adjustments the cell makes to maintain its rapid growth and division. But first, we must take a quick look into how healthy cells metabolize and maintain life. Okay, so don't worry. I'm not going to turn this into some biology lecture and ramble on about every step and all the various cell cycles, although as a biochemist, I would love to do that. But rather, we'll focus on the big picture and the implications of these processes, and just trot around the details of each cell cycle. So we've covered that metabolism is the process of maintaining life. And for us, you and I, we don't produce our own energy necessary to stay alive. Plants do this by harvesting raw energy from the sun's photons to produce sugar and power their various plant needs. But we, on the other hand, must eat and break down food to harvest energy from the food's nutrients. Now, it takes a lot of energy to run a human. I mean, your body temperature has to be kept at 37 degrees Celsius, and you're constantly walking, talking, and checking Twitter for the latest Elon Musk blunder. Our bodies have evolved a rather profound method at generating this energy, using the sugar in foods we eat. By way of a quite complicated process known as cellular respiration, our cells consume glucose, aka sugar, and the oxygen we breathe in to produce carbon dioxide we breathe out and energy as ATP. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is a molecule full of energy, and maybe you've heard it referred to as the energy currency of our cells. For now, you don't need to understand why it's so energetic or how our cells utilize it, but you do need to know it is essential for powering nearly every process our bodies perform, from carrying out chemical reactions in our cells to muscle contraction and even thinking. Now, when we eat foods that contain sugar, that sugar eventually ends up in our bloodstream and later in our cells. When the sugar first arrives to the cell, it passes the cell membrane and enters the cytoplasm of the cell. If you recall from high school biology, the cytoplasm is just a jelly-like fluid that all our cell bits float around in. Then, in the first step of cellular respiration, our cells take a glucose molecule, and remember, that's just sugar, and toss it between a series of 10 different enzymes to break it into two smaller molecules called pyruvate. By the way, an enzyme is just a helper molecule that helps facilitate a chemical reaction. This 10-step series of chemical reactions in which sugar is broken down is a process known as glycolysis. The act of breaking glucose down by glycolysis provides us with a little bit of energy, exactly 2 ATP molecules. Glycolysis is just the first step of cellular respiration, but by contrast, upon completion of the whole respiration process, 38 ATP molecules in total are produced, nearly 20 times the measly 2 ATP from breaking down sugar. In the next step of cellular respiration, the products of glycolysis, remember the 2 pyruvate molecules, get shipped away from free floating in the cytoplasm to the mitochondria. That's right, the powerhouse of the cell. When the pyruvate molecules arrive to the mitochondria, they get thrown into a never-ending cycle known as the Krebs cycle, aka the citric acid cycle, aka the tricarboxylic acid cycle, aka the TCA cycle. Now I think I understand why people don't get biochemistry. We can't even make up our own minds for naming things. Anyway, what's really interesting about this Krebs cycle, which I will be referring to it as from here on, is that this cycle can spin one way, or it can reverse and spin the other way. Now, buckle up, this is where things get wild. If the Krebs cycle spins in the direction of cellular respiration, where it takes in the products of glycolysis, those pyruvate molecules get broken down even more into carbon dioxide and hydrogen atoms. These hydrogen atoms are very important because they carry a positive charge. Then, in the third and final stage of cellular respiration, the mitochondria use these hydrogen atoms along with oxygen to essentially create electricity, and a lot of it. If you were to take all the mitochondria in your body and iron them out into a flat sheet, well, for one, you would immediately die. But also, that flat sheet of mitochondria would have the same area as about 20 professional soccer pitches, and would contain more charged up electricity than a bolt of lightning. Then, the mitochondria use this tremendous amount of electricity to power a molecular motor called ATP synthase. I'm not making this up. This molecular motor, as the name suggests, generates energy in the form of ATP, about 38 ATP molecules for each sugar molecule broken down. And that is how our bodies maintain life, at least in normal, healthy cells. Cancer cells do not metabolize sugar by cellular respiration in the same way that healthy cells do. Let's think back to Otto Warburg and his proposal that damaged mitochondria are to blame for cancer. He wasn't totally wrong to think this, but today, in reality, we now know that while changes in cancer cell metabolism do occur in the mitochondria, they aren't necessarily damaged. If you recall, as I previously mentioned, the Krebs cycle, which takes place in the mitochondria, can spin one way or the other. We discussed what happens when the Krebs cycle spins in the direction of cellular respiration. Pyruvate molecules get broken into hydrogen atoms and then used to make ATP. What we have not discussed is when the Krebs cycle spins in the other direction. When the Krebs cycle spins in the opposite direction of cellular respiration, instead of producing carbon dioxide and hydrogen atoms, it uses carbon dioxide and hydrogen atoms to produce biological building blocks. Aha! Now, cancer cells love this. All cancer cells want to do is make copies of themselves, grow and divide. In order to do this, they use the building blocks from the reversed Krebs cycle to build new cells. And thus, cancer cells do not use the products of glycolysis in the Krebs cycle for cellular respiration to make 38 ATP molecules. Now, you may be asking, well, then where do cancer cells get their energy? I thought you said ATP was essential for powering all processes, but now they're missing out on 38 ATP molecules? To which I would say, fantastic question. First, cancer cells prioritize proliferation, building new cells, so they're not so concerned with producing the energy required to maintain life. But also, again, if you recall from earlier, I mentioned that the process of glycolysis, breaking down a sugar molecule into 2-pyruvate, produces 2 ATP molecules of energy. And while that's not a lot of energy, this all ties back to Otto Warburg and his initial observation that started this all. Cancer cells eat up much more sugar than healthy cells do, and they do this to make up for all the ATP they're missing out on from cellular respiration. It's truly amazing the progress we made in understanding cancer since Warburg in the 1920s. Also, one more thing to note, there's another fate of the pyruvate molecules produced by glycolysis. Instead of being shipped to the mitochondria for 38 ATP, they can be used in another pathway and converted into lactate molecules, producing an additional 2 ATP. Albeit lackluster compared to respiration. So by the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate and the conversion into lactate, cancer cells can produce 4 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule they eat, in addition to their increased sugar uptake. So to recap, in order for cancer cells to sustain their rapid growth and division, they utilize the reverse Krebs cycle to produce biological building blocks from carbon dioxide and hydrogen, as opposed to healthy cells, which utilize the forward Krebs cycle to generate lots of energy that our bodies require, since we're generally not replicating as often as cancer cells. In addition, cancer cells obtain their energy by increasing their sugar uptake and thus increasing the amount of ATP produced by glycolysis while also converting the glycolytic products into lactate for a little more ATP. And this is how cancer survives and is able to take control of our bodies using their selfish agenda of rapid growth and division. Okay, so why bother? Why spend the past 70, 80, 90 years researching a cancer cell's sugary diet? I mean, I for one would be pretty embarrassed if you researched my sugary diet for the past 20 years. And why don't we have a cure for cancer yet? The truth is, the mechanisms behind how cancer works are very complex, and even this discussion was very simplified. But every little step we take closer to understanding what cancer is and how it survives is a step closer to finally shutting the door on cancer and developing new treatment options, and inevitably, one day, a cure. That is what science is. Not quick and easy, but well studied and developed. Science takes time, and with enough time and enough support for research into cancer's nature, we will eventually conquer our body's selfish cells.